Canada is stepping back onto the global stage with a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, new trade ambitions, and tensions between the United States and Canada already surfacing. Just days after an Ontario ad aired on American networks, one that featured Ronald Reagan's 1987 speech warning against tariffs.
Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. America's jobs and growth are at stake.
President Trump responded by slapping an additional 10% tariff on Canada. When asked what went wrong with Washington, Prime Minister Mark Carney's answer was blunt.
It's a question for him.
From rising tension with the United States and Beijing to war in Ukraine, a volatile Middle East, and growing pressure to lead on climate, how does Canada navigate it all while redefining itself under Mark Carney's leadership? I spoke with Professor Robert Howse from New York University and Roland from the University of Ottawa to get the answers. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to Deep Dish. Let me just launch right in. Roland, you also worked for Justin Trudeau, the former Prime Minister, as a foreign policy advisor. Give us a sense of where Canada is today. You know, what's most at stake for Canada from an economic, national identity perspective, but also Canada's role in the world. How is it seeking to define and position itself? Big question, but I'd love to hear it from you.
It's a transformative moment for Canada. It is for many countries in the world, but Canada is pretty uniquely exposed to the kinds of pressures that we're seeing from the Trump administration. Maybe Mexico would also be in that category. Canada's economy is robust, but it is very dependent on the United States. 76% of the goods exports from Canada go to the United States, accounting for a really enormous portion of Canada's overall GNP. And so to have the rules of the game effectively upended, and to have a U.S. president who's basically saying that a lot of the assumptions about access to the U.S. market now can no longer be taken for granted. In fact, you can't have access unless you pay to play. And we're not even sure exactly, like every other country, what he wants. It depends on the day. Really has been completely disruptive. Now, if you layer on top of that some of his remarks about Canada becoming the 51st state, you get the economic uncertainty and you get these casual remarks about ending Canadian sovereignty, which are maybe not that serious, but they've combined to generate a great deal of concern in the Canadian populace and certainly shape the outcome of the last election in April that brought Mark Carney to power.
So, Rob, let me come to you. Before the second Trump administration, how was Canada doing economically, geopolitically, socially? How would you set a baseline for us in understanding Canada's place on the eve of Donald Trump's second inauguration?
I would have to put this in perhaps a longer historical timeline. Since the departure of Pierre Trudeau from the Canadian political scene in the early 1980s, Canada's political and certainly economic elites have basically embraced a closer relationship with the United States, and then later, with a fair amount of enthusiasm, neoliberal globalization. And so these currents in Canadian policy are in some tension with the efforts of Pierre Trudeau to build a distinctive Canadian identity and project it globally. My sense is there is a much weaker sense of the rationale for Canada as a sovereign state and any particular distinctive contribution that it might make globally. So Canada finds itself in many ways a taker rather than a maker of global order, or indeed today a certain amount of disorder. This said, it seems to me that the kind of absurd TV ad that Doug Ford had run in the United States about Ronald Reagan conceals something that tensions or disagreements between Canada and the United States, despite the fantasy of Canada's elites that they wanted to become as close to America. And if you go back to the Reagan years of the national energy policy, and in fact, contrary to the misleading suggestion of that ad, the Reagan administration increased duties on Canada and certainly threatened to increase them even more. And that was one of the reasons political elites and economic elites wanted an agreement with the United States. They thought that this was the best response to the Reagan administration's increasing protectionist duties against Canada. So to really contrast President Trump's policy so starkly with the approach of the Reagan administration to trade relations with Canada is, I think, misleading, if not outright false.
So there's tension over the years between the U.S. and Canada, but what you're suggesting, and I want to get Roland's take on this, is that up until the current moment, perhaps, when we're seeing a shift, Canada has essentially sought to deepen its relationship with the United States. Obviously, the North America Free Trade Agreement, now the USMCA, or CUSMA, from a Canadian perspective, has further integrated the economies. That neoliberalism, that term was part of this. But that separate focus on Canadian identity was really not at the front of Canada's projection of its global role since Pierre Trudeau. But Roland, what is your take on Canada? Again, we're going to get to Trump 2.0 because that's where we're all focused. But before Trump 2.0, was Canada trying to stake out its own special role on the global stage?
Well, listen, Canada's an interesting country in the sense that it's always operated on the margins of an empire. It was a colonial state for a very long time on the margins of the British Empire as the United States was gaining power, and it was trying to navigate its relationships with Britain and gain more autonomy. And then the United States became very powerful, and then the challenge for Canada became navigating its relationship with the United States, being able to preserve its own autonomy and sovereignty to gain the benefits of the relationship with the more powerful state. And so it's not surprising that one of the recurring themes throughout Canadian history and in conversations about Canadian identity is how close or far away is Canada from the United States. In a way, Canada exists in order to create an entity that is sufficiently coherent not to be absorbed by the 19th century expansionist version of the United States. And so this debate has come back and forth, and I'm not going to bore your listeners with the details, but there have been moments where the consensus has been we need to be more autonomous and more protected from the United States. And there have been moments when the decision has been, well, we have more to gain by integrating with the United States with one really important proviso, which is that deeper integration will be governed by a shared set of rules. That was the gamble in the 1980s with free trade with the United States. The idea was, well, listen, as long as we have structures that can manage this relationship where there's such an imbalance of power, then those structures can help us. A rules-based system. And so that also explains Canada's interest in multilateralism in the world. If you're not a superpower, if you're not a great power, rules matter a lot, but they especially matter in relation with the United States. So yes, of course, we've had trade disputes with the United States even during this period of greater integration. Softwood lumber that Rob mentions is described once, I heard it described in the Canadian Foreign Ministry as like the Vietnam unit, in the sense that it was this quagmire, endless dispute. But there is a qualitative and quantitative change with Trump too, and that is he doesn't care about the rules. The United States always was kind of making exceptions to the rules with softwood lumber, et cetera. Now he's thrown the rule book out. And so this is what's really different. And this is what prompted Mark Carney to say, we need to completely rethink our economy, our relations with the United States and with the rest of the world. It's another moment in the pendulum swinging back and forth in Canadian history.
Okay, so let me turn to you, Rob, on this. First of all, we know President Trump started very quickly after his inauguration, during his inauguration, talking about Canada as possibly the 51st state, that he was very focused on the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, tariffs have been at the center of Donald Trump's policies, and Canada has been the target of that. How much is this just a swing in the pendulum, or is this something that's creating a fundamental rethink for Canadians, as well as for Mark Carney as the leader, of Canada's identity, of its policies, internally, externally? I mean, tell us, Rob, how much of a shift is this? What is changing?
Well, I want to put this supposed rule breaking of President Trump in perspective. First of all, USMCA has not been repudiated by the Trump administration. It's up for review in 2026. There are, I believe, congressional committee hearings about how that review should be used by the United States, and Canada's participating in it, and Mexico as well. And if you look at the fine print, with all the instability that appears to be the case with tariffs, certainly some respect for the USMCA is indicated by the particular treatment of USMCA compliant goods. So I don't think we should exaggerate. President Trump has gone about making new agreements with a lot of countries. Now, if you talk to veterans of old-fashioned trade law and policy, they're skeptical that these are real agreements, because to them, a trade agreement is something that's negotiated over years, and people agonize over fine print words. It might take 10 years from the initial conceptualization to getting it through legislatures. And then it has a stately dispute settlement procedure where you might go through 2 or 3 years of quasi-judicial proceedings, and then you would have a ruling. And then the question would be, would it be complied with, or would you have a settlement? I don't think that President Trump created a world that is going a lot faster. AI, critical minerals, crypto, geopolitical questions with China. Things are moving too fast to imagine going back, I think, to those more traditional ways of making trade law and policy. We saw that with the pandemic as well. What was the use of suing in the WTO dispute settlement system if other countries were closing their borders in PPE and vaccines? You had to have a solution much more in real time. And so these agreements that the administration is negotiating are not a product of a visceral dislike for rules or anti-legalism, but a recognition that the old kind of trade legalism is not that suited for this kind of really fast-paced and very unstable world where there are so many uncertainties about the future that it's very hard to make new rules, say on digital, when we don't know really what the ultimate potential, good or bad, for AI is.
Rob, let me ask you one follow-up question on this. You see Donald Trump as responding to a very dynamic and changed situation, but do you think that it's being received in this way by Canada's Prime Minister and by the Canadian people? In other words, is it possible that you're right, but in fact it's still having a critical impact on how Canada thinks about itself, thinks about its relationship with the United States, positions itself on the global stage? I mean, what is happening as a result, even if you're accurate in the reasons for this new style of trade negotiations? What's the impact on Canada?
Before I immigrated to the United States, I worked on internal trade in Canada, trying to reduce the barriers between the provinces. When we had the initial constitutional reform came to fruition in 1982, where we got our own modern constitution with a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there had been an effort to break down trade barriers between the provinces. But that was something that was largely sacrificed through a set of political compromises with provinces that really wanted to keep Canada balkanized, because that was the interest of those provincial power elites, and at least their perceived interest. And it became very hard because after Pierre Trudeau, the predominant way of looking at this issue was be nice to the provinces. And ultimately, there was a great deal of accommodation of provincial elites, and mostly these barriers have remained in place. Whether loss of complacency about dependency on the United States, a complacency that was cultivated in the Canadian people by the political and economic elites in the country for a long time, can re-energize the effort to remove these barriers between Canadian provinces is a good question. I would hope yes.
Okay, Roland, so I can see you have a different perspective. What has, and we're hearing this from Canadians in spades, that this Trump moment is reimagining how Canadians think of themselves. Tell us the impact of Trump's second administration.
Well, it's been remarkable, but let me just go back quickly and address something that Rob said about the changing context of international trade and how we're seeing new kinds of trade deals emerge to match this new context, and we're not going to go back to the old. And I agree that we're not going to go back to the old, but I think it's a stretch to suggest that the kinds of quote unquote deals that Trump has been negotiating and his approach to international trade as some kind of rational response to the shifting nature of trade with more digital trade and AI, et cetera. It is Trump acting as deal maker in his most capricious and extractive and predatory kind of way. So there's not a lot of vision about a future world system in this. And in fact, why I say that he's throwing the rules out is that nobody can trust that the agreements that he makes are going to actually stick. He doesn't give anyone that confidence, and the very fact that the USMCA, which he negotiated after saying that the NAFTA was the worst trade agreement in the history of the world, he negotiated the USMCA, which he said was the best trade agreement in the history of the world, and there is no guarantee. In fact, most people here think that the USMCA is going to be subject to very fundamental change when it comes up for review, and many people question whether it will even continue. So all of this uncertainty has created an environment in Canada where people are very concerned about the economy and about the future of the country and its direction. And this is not just a trade issue. Look at the auto sector in Canada since the 1960s. We've been building cars with the United States together under an auto pact agreement. Right now, the auto sector in Canada, it's the single largest manufactured export from Canada. You know, it's right there after oil. It counts for more than 500,000 direct and indirect jobs in a country that 41 million people. It's regionally concentrated, so you can only imagine the politics of that. So there are really devastating potential consequences. There's only so much Canada can do. One of the solutions has been, according to Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, he's putting a lot of effort into trying to diversify Canada's trade. He says he wants to double trade with the rest of the world. He's in Asia right now having those conversations. He's been to Europe many times, and he's made Canada a partner in the Rearm Europe program, where Canada will be able to work with Europe as it spends a lot more on its own defense, for example. He's also trying to negotiate with Trump, but unlike, say, Japan and the UK, he's not going to rush to a terrible deal. Both of those countries got terrible deals with Trump. The UK locked in a 10% tariff on UK imports into the United States. And the security of that deal is very much in question. What is the enforceability of that deal? Japan, basically agreed to a $500 billion investment scheme in the United States. I mean, this is just extortionist. So yes, Canada will continue to negotiate, and there's some prospect of agreement in areas where the United States can't simply replace Canadian goods like aluminum and steel or energy or critical minerals. We'll see what happens with the USMCA, but it's a moment of potential significant change in Canada, and Mark Carney has very much stood up and articulated that.
I mean, as we're coming to kind of the end of this conversation, and we could go on for a very long time, I think we should come back to it. Rob, the question I want to ask you is, does the U.S. stand to lose anything? I mean, through these tactics, is it all win for the United States if it can get a better deal with Canada, with other countries on the trade front? Is there anything to be lost?
Definitely, I would say that the elements of disruption of entrenched expectations that are part of the U.S. administration's approach, it creates certain risks. But I don't think if you want to move forward beyond neoliberalism and that form of globalization, if you want to move forward beyond what I consider to be a very dangerous dependency and interdependency with China, our major geopolitical rival, that we can't even build our own ships, whereas they turn them out on assembly lines, then you have to take risks. I don't think there's an off-the-shelf better alternative. There might be different styles of deal-making and diplomacy. President Trump is who he is. He developed himself as a professional in the kind of Wild West world of New York real estate, right, in the 70s and 80s. And that's who he is. He comes from a different place. And with that, I think it's understandable that he has a different style. And I, as a legal academic and former diplomat, albeit in my previous country, would have also a different style. But I don't think that those who are attacking President Trump's approach, some of them are just want to go back to neoliberalism. The Peterson Institute people like Jason Furman, and they still believe in the dogma of neoliberal globalization, that it's good for America, it's good for the world. But if you don't believe that, then you have to admit, frankly, that there is no kind of off-the-shelf strategy to move to a different place that reflects the difficult and fast-changing political, geopolitical, and economic realities of America and the world today.
Roland, I got to give you a chance to respond to Rob on this. There's, the comment, there's no going back. There was a big comment in there about reducing the U.S. and presumably Canada's dependence on China. What is your kind of take on this, and how would you wrap up the stage one of this conversation?
Obviously, we have to deal with the world as it is and as it's emerging. And Trump is who he is. That's entirely true. But, listen, Rob's a lawyer. The fundamental question about the rule of law and respect for the rule of law is a real question with regard to Trump personally and the Trump administration, both within the United States and how it deals with people and other actors overseas. Now, the United States has always played a little fast and loose with international law, but it's a matter of degree. And so it's not a choice between saying, hey, this is Trump, this is the new world, or you want to go back to some bankrupt old orthodoxy. Obviously, we don't want to go backwards, but there are variations on the new world. Trump is just one variation. One of Canada's strategies is to recognize that Trumpism is here to stay. We have to deal with this. But we're also going to do everything we can to try and increase our resilience and reduce our dependence. And so that includes trying to build even closer ties with Europe, with countries that are trustworthy partners, because the United States is not a trustworthy trade partner now and will not be as long as Trump is the president, and also to expand ties in Asia with the ultimate goal potentially of building some kind of alliance that brings together the Canada, European Union, UK trade agreements with the Trans-Pacific Partnership countries, of which the UK is already becoming a member. That's where the direction of travel is for Canada right now. But just to come back to your earlier question, what's the mood in Canada right now? And with regard to China, Canada's not dependent on China. China's our second largest trading partner, but we send a tiny fraction of our exports to China. There is some interest in this country in trying to navigate with China a little bit more effectively than we have before, because China's also an untrustworthy trading partner. But China is an export market for us at a moment when we have to work with the United States. It's our principal partner. But you look at public opinion polls in this country where people are asked questions like, here's a list of countries. From an overall point of view, should the Canadian government approach these countries as enemies, potential threats, or cautiously or friendly? What's really striking, a recent poll by Angus Reid, China, Canadians said 34% of Canadians said treat China as an enemy or potential threat, 34%. For the United States, 46% said treat the United States as an enemy or potential threat. The government of Canada will never do that. They're going to navigate the relationship with the United States no matter what. But if you want a little flavor of the mood in this country, there you have it.
Roland Paris and Robert Howse, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Deep Dish on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Leslie Vinjamori. Talk to you next week. Deep Dish is a production of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you get your podcasts. And if someone you know might find it interesting, send it their way. As a reminder, the opinions you heard belong to the people who expressed them and not to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Tria Raimundo and Jessica Brzeski, with support from Marty O'Connell and Lizzie Sokolich. Thank you for listening.